Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents A Path to Peace, a brief history of Israeli-Palestinian negotiations and a way forward in the Middle East, by George Mitchell and Alon Sachar, narrated by Mel Foster. Introduction. This is the saddest day of my life since becoming Prime Minister. The leader of Israel was referring to the moment the U.S. ambassador to his country delivered a letter informing him that the president was days away from unveiling a sweeping proposal for peace between Israel and the Palestinians. The president's speech was to be delivered from the Rose Garden of the White House. The world would be watching. The ambassador, in the most uncomfortable of diplomatic circumstances, was instructed by the White House to hand-deliver the letter to the Prime Minister, who was vacationing with his wife in northern Israel. It was their first vacation together in years, and they were caught off guard. The Prime Minister's response was blunt. "Please inform the President that I have read his letter and am most unhappy both with its content and its implications. I have also listened very carefully to your oral message and am extremely upset by its contents. You may tell the President and the Secretary of State that I am astonished that your government did not see fit to indicate that such an initiative was in the making, or to consult with the government of Israel at any stage of its elaboration. This is entirely unacceptable." The Prime Minister tried to buy time to consult with his cabinet, to consider his response, and to reshape the initiative. But the President refused. To the contrary, he moved the speech up by 2 days. Having sent copies of the proposal to the leaders of Egypt, Jordan, and Saudi Arabia, the President worried that its contents would prematurely reach the media and undermine the impact of his speech. When the Prime Minister was informed that the speech would proceed despite his objection, and that he had even less time to consider his reaction, his outrage grew, and he asked the ambassador, "Is this the way to treat a friend? Is this the way to treat an ally? Your government consorts with our despotic enemies, and yet you choose to ignore us on a matter of vital import to our future? What kind of discourse is this between democratic peoples who purport to cherish common values? Is this the way to make peace? We do not deserve this kind of treatment." Harsh words from the leader of one friendly country to the ambassador of another. But the outrage and bitter response were not from Benjamin Netanyahu to a proposal made by Barack Obama, as you might suppose. This was Menachem Begin responding to Ronald Reagan in 1982. The United States has long had strategic, moral, and domestic political reasons for its support of Israel. Even though the personal relationship between Obama and Netanyahu has been strained, U.S.-Israeli policy disagreements are neither new nor unusual. Despite the exceedingly close ties between the two countries, strong and often public disagreements between presidents and prime ministers have been common. We will describe some of those disagreements and some agreements as well. In 2001, amid the Second Palestinian Intifada, as chairman of an international commission on violence in the Middle East, I met several times with Yasser Arafat, president of the Palestinian Authority. On one occasion, described later in more detail, I urged him to resume negotiations with Israel. He insisted that he, too, wanted an agreement, but that it had to be acceptable to the Palestinian people. Many felt, of course, that the proposals made by Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak at Camp David, and later by President Bill Clinton, should have been acceptable. But there were no further negotiations during Arafat's lifetime. Nearly a decade later, I returned to the Middle East as President Obama's special envoy. I met frequently with the Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas, most often in his office in the presidential compound in Ramallah. We usually began with lunch, attended by about a dozen people, half or more members of his cabinet or staff, half or fewer members of my staff or that of the U.S. Consul. During and after lunch we had a general discussion, after which Abbas and I, sometimes alone, sometimes with one aide each, moved to a small meeting space adjacent to his office. There most of what may be called our business took place. Now 81, Abbas has been active in Palestinian politics for most of his adult life. His views have evolved over time, as did those of the organizations he now leads, the Palestinian Liberation Organization and the Palestinian Authority. For more than a quarter century he has been the most prominent and vocal Palestinian advocate of their current policy, which recognizes Israel, opposes violence against Israel, and favors peaceful negotiations to achieve an independent Palestinian state. On several occasions I said essentially the same thing to Abbas that I had said to Arafat, urging him to negotiate with Israel. In response, Abbas said he wanted a peace agreement, but he offered many reasons for his reluctance to enter direct negotiations. The devastation of the recent Gaza war had aroused strong negative emotions. He deeply distrusted Netanyahu, and Israeli settlements continued to expand. The Kadima-controlled Israeli government under Ariel Sharon, Ehud Olmert, and Tzipi Livni had withdrawn settlers from Gaza. The Likud-controlled government under Netanyahu included settlers and others on the Israeli right who had said repeatedly that there should never be a Palestinian state in the West Bank. They believe that all of the West Bank is and should always be an integral part of Israel. Both societies are now divided between those who favor and those who oppose a two-state solution. I also met often with Netanyahu. As with Abbas, our meetings usually involved an initial discussion with a dozen or more officials, followed by a smaller group, occasionally just the two of us, in his personal office. Like all Israeli leaders, Netanyahu's primary goal, repeated often in our discussions, is to preserve Israel's security. On the question of whether peace can best be achieved by a two-state solution, his position has fluctuated between strong opposition and tepid support. Most recently he said he favors it, but that the time was not yet right. In each of his meetings with me, and in many public comments, Netanyahu has expressed a desire for an agreement with the Palestinians and his willingness to meet and negotiate personally with Abbas. They met 4 times in September 2010. Along with Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, I was present at those discussions and will describe them in what follows. Based on these experiences, I reached the conclusion that Netanyahu and Abbas have very different visions of peace and the two-state solution. Netanyahu does not believe that Abbas has the personal or political strength necessary to gain approval of and implement an agreement with Israel. Abbas believes that Netanyahu is not sincere or serious about making an agreement with the Palestinians, and does only as much as he deems necessary to placate the United States. Since both men assume that negotiations will not succeed, neither has any incentive to take the political risks that will inevitably be required to make an agreement possible. The reluctance of the leaders is understandable, but as we describe in the chapters of this book, the reluctance is contrary to the immediate and long-term interests of the people they represent. We believe those interests on both sides will be best served by an agreement that accepts Israel's existence and provides its people with reasonable and sustainable security behind defensible borders, and at the same time creates a sovereign, independent, non-militarized Palestinian state. That has been and remains the basis for and the objective of U.S. policy under both Republican and Democratic presidents. We support that policy. As the dominant world power, the United States has relationships with almost all of the countries in the world. It is natural and understandable that each of our allies wants us to adopt and pursue policies favorable to their interests. But many of those countries have disagreements among themselves, in some cases devolving into war. As a result, there is an inevitable tension in our relationships, a balancing that requires a combination of consistency and ingenuity in U.S. statesmanship. That is a delicate task, calling for knowledge, strength, skill, and tact, especially since our primary objective is, and must be, defending and advancing our national interest. Nowhere is this task more obvious or more difficult than in the Middle East. The United States invaded Afghanistan in 2001 and Iraq in 2003, where we remain deeply engaged. In 2010, the Arab Spring erupted, bringing hope and a sense of renewal. That hope has dissipated, and now the people of the region struggle through the misery of seemingly unending war, displacement, and upheaval. If anything, the Arab Spring has reminded us of the harsh reality of history, that the removal by revolution of an oppressive regime does not guarantee better governance or a better life. Russia, under the Tsars and then Stalin, is a prime example. In the United States, it took years to achieve a somewhat equitable and stable political order. Indeed, the American experiment continues to this day. The complexity of the Middle East is illustrated by the tangle of our relationships there in 2016. We oppose the Assad regime in Syria, and we also oppose ISIS, which is fighting the Assad regime. The Syrian Kurds join us in opposing ISIS, but are being attacked by Turkey, one of our allies. We also combat ISIS in Iraq, where we are joined by Shia militias who are supported by Iran, whom we oppose. In Afghanistan, we oppose the Taliban, who receive some support from Pakistan, another of our allies. Pakistan, meanwhile, has fought several wars with India, another of our allies. Israel is, and will remain, our closest ally in the region. But we also are allied with many Arab and Muslim countries. During both Republican and Democratic administrations, we have maintained a naval base in Bahrain and a large facility in Qatar. For decades, we have had close relationships with Turkey, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates, pillars of the Sunni Muslim world. Oman played a key role in helping to arrange the negotiations that led to the nuclear agreement between Iran and the United States, China, Russia, Britain, Germany, and France. We have a close relationship with Indonesia, the largest Muslim majority country in the world. Of the 7.4 billion people on Earth today, 23%, about 1.6 billion, are Muslim. Sometime after mid-century, the total population will reach 9.6 billion, and 31%, or about 3 billion, will be Muslim. To put that in perspective, 3 billion was the total world population as recently as 1960. In the 21st century, what happens in the Muslim world will affect everyone, in particular the dominant world power, the United States. The regional projections are daunting for Israel. By mid-century, the number of Israeli Jews is estimated to be 12.5 million at most, while the number of Arabs will be around 600 million. The United States has a clear and compelling national interest in remaining involved in the Middle East, and in doing all we can to reduce violence and upheaval, and to combat radical Islamic extremism. As of this writing, the U.S. remains heavily engaged in the region, working to protect the American people from acts of terrorism, to ensure Israel's security, to resist Iran's drive for regional hegemony, to defeat ISIS in Iraq and Syria, to help other Arab countries resist terrorism and achieve stability, to stabilize Iraq, and to defeat the Taliban in and stabilize Afghanistan, among other objectives. Inevitably, there will be many more years of disruption, and no single policy or action can solve all of the region's problems. But a peaceful resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict would be a significant step that might enable some of the countries, including Israel and Saudi Arabia, to cooperate in opposing their common foes, Iran and terrorist organizations, those supported by and those opposed to Iran. We recognize the daunting difficulty of finding a resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. We acknowledge the long litany of failed past efforts. We are especially mindful of the current complexities in the region that work against an early resolution. It is, of course, easier to describe the problem than to prescribe a solution. We are not certain that we know what to do, but we are certain of what we and everyone else should not do. We must not lapse into despair at the difficulty, and we must avoid inaction. For that reason, we present what we believe to be a realistic path to peace. We explain why we believe that is through a two-state solution. At the very least, we hope to stimulate debate and to renew movement toward negotiations. All of us who care about the region and its people, in particular Israelis and Palestinians, must do whatever we can to advocate and work for an end to that conflict. In the Middle East, history is an ever-present part of daily life. Walking the streets of its modern cities does not dull the sensation of walking on the same ground once trod by Moses and Abraham, by Jesus Christ, and by the prophet Muhammad. Proposals for the future, intended to help solve the problems of the present, cannot fairly be evaluated without some knowledge of the past. We do not offer a comprehensive retelling of that history in this book. Instead, we describe the modern history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, highlighting those events that led to the prevailing attitudes in each society today. We hope this concise narrative will enable the listener to better understand our suggested path to peace. 1. Leaders in disagreement. The exchange between Begin and Reagan, the saddest of the Israeli Prime Minister's life, took place in 1982. Reagan's timing was not random. Israel had just withdrawn the last of its troops from Egypt's Sinai Peninsula in accordance with the peace treaty between the two nations. 2 months after the withdrawal, the Israeli army invaded Lebanon in an effort to push out Arafat and his Palestine Liberation Organization. From there, the Palestinians had launched attacks on Israel's northern cities and towns. Israel's military operation in Lebanon lasted for months, ending only with U.S. mediation and when the PLO agreed to leave Lebanese territory. With Israel out of the Sinai, the violence in Lebanon reduced, a pro-Western government set to be inaugurated in Beirut, and the PLO on the run, President Reagan decided to adopt a Fresh Start initiative. He hoped to capitalize on what suddenly appeared to be a favorable regional environment. The core of the initiative was a comprehensive diplomatic solution to Israel's conflict with the Palestinians and its Arab neighbors, to be achieved in part by providing autonomy for Palestinians in parts of the West Bank. But Begin immediately and categorically rejected the Reagan plan. Relinquishing control of any of the West Bank was antithetical to his ideological commitment to Israeli control of biblical Jewish lands, and he had just paid a heavy price to push the PLO away from Israel's northern borders. Palestinian autonomy, Begin worried, would bring them right back. U.S. and Israeli policy disagreements have existed since the relationship first began. President Harry Truman, 1945-53, is often celebrated for initiating our close and strategic partnership with Israel. But that good relationship was not a foregone conclusion in the decades following Israel's independence. From the outset of his administration, President Truman concerned himself with the plight of Jewish refugees, the survivors of Hitler's final solution, who remained stranded in dilapidated, displaced persons camps in Europe. Israelis have never forgotten that he was the first world leader to recognize their fledgling state, just 11 minutes after their 1948 Declaration of Independence. At our last meeting, recalled David Ben-Gurion, a founding father of Israel and its first prime minister, I told Truman that as a foreigner I could not judge what would be his place in American history, but his helpfulness to us, his constant sympathy with our aims in Israel, his courageous decision to recognize our new state so quickly, and his steadfast support since then, had given him an immortal place in Jewish history. As I said that, tears suddenly sprang to his eyes, and his eyes were still wet when he bade me goodbye. The early years of the U.S. relationship with Israel took place within the context of the Cold War. With Soviet influence entrenched in Eastern and Central Europe, Asia, and beyond, the United States believed it urgent to prevent the Soviets from gaining a foothold in the Middle East. Even with his sympathies, Truman's decision to recognize Israel was not easy or automatic, because he feared that either Israel or the Arab states would be pushed into the arms of the Soviets. His initial inclination was for a binational arrangement in which Jews and Arabs would coexist. Therefore, his decision to recognize Israel surprised even some of the most senior officials in his administration. One day after Israel's declaration of independence, Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Saudi Arabia began military action against the new state. This first of several Arab-Israeli wars lasted 10 months. Israel was ultimately victorious, and without U.S. military assistance, as Truman had imposed an arms embargo on both sides. The policy of pursuing balance in America's relationship with the Arab states and Israel continued for decades. In 1956, President Dwight Eisenhower did what today is unimaginable. He threatened to break off ties with Israel altogether. This crisis in relations followed a combined surprise attack by France, Britain, and Israel to gain control of the Suez Canal, which had just been seized and nationalized by Egypt's President Gamal Abdel Nasser. Because the canal provided the shortest route for ships traveling between Europe and Asia, its geopolitical significance at the time, and even today, cannot be overstated. France and Britain had their own reasons for initiating the war, not least of which was to protect their influence and interests in the region. The British government was the largest shareholder in the Suez Canal, and British and French shippers among its largest patrons. Israel believed Nasser's populism and celebrity status posed a threat to its existence. Nasser had become the charismatic face of pan-Arab nationalism, positioning himself as the leader who would unite the Arab world and destroy Israel. To that end, Egypt had for years supported a steady stream of Palestinian guerrilla attacks into Israel, and enforced a blockade against Israel's southern port city on the Red Sea. Following Egypt's nationalization of the canal, Nasser banned its use by Israel. Eisenhower worried that armed conflict would enhance Soviet influence in the Middle East. Though wary of Nasser and his arms deals with the Soviet Union, Eisenhower disfavored war and preferred a diplomatic solution to the Suez Crisis. He immediately and unambiguously cautioned the British and the French against armed conflict. When they did not heed his warning and proceeded to involve Israel in their plans, Eisenhower was shocked and angered. With the Soviet Union threatening to engage militarily in support of Nasser, Eisenhower scrambled to end the war in a way that preserved regional balance. But by then, Israeli forces had taken full control of Sinai. Over strong objections from the Israelis, Eisenhower pushed through a United Nations resolution calling for their full and immediate withdrawal. He warned Israel that failing to comply with the resolution would impair the friendly cooperation between our two countries. Eisenhower went so far as to threaten to cut off U.S. assistance to Israel, to seek Israel's eviction from the UN, and to withhold U.S. support in the event of an attack by Soviet allied forces. Ben-Gurion desperately sought a meeting with the president to explain his position, that Israel was reluctant to simply withdraw its forces without clear assurances of its security and its continuing right to navigate the canal and other international waters. But Eisenhower refused to meet until after Israel agreed to withdraw. Ben-Gurion complied, but bitterly. The Suez Crisis was the lowest moment in U.S. relations with Israel. Efforts to prevent the Middle East from becoming yet another Cold War arena had failed, for the Soviet Union made inroads. Cairo, Baghdad, and other Arab capitals drew closer to Moscow. In the land of King David, Israel believed that resisting Arab Goliaths would require a giant ally of its own, and America came to view Israelis as partners in curbing and offsetting Soviet influence. Under the Kennedy and Johnson administrations, Israel received its first large-scale shipments of sophisticated American weapons systems, including anti-aircraft missiles, tanks, and jet fighter planes. The sales were intended to help Israel maintain its defenses against the larger and better-armed Arab states still bent on its destruction, and also to counterbalance Soviet arms pouring into the region. In return, Israel provided the United States with intelligence information about Soviet weapons systems and the USSR's posture in the Middle East. President John F. Kennedy told Israel's Foreign Minister Golda Meir, "The United States has a special relationship with Israel in the Middle East, really comparable only to what it has with Britain over a wide range of world affairs." He was the first president to speak of this special relationship by name, but he also said, "For us to play properly the role we are called upon to play, we cannot afford the luxury of identifying Israel as our exclusive friends and letting other countries go." To preserve its influence in the region, the United States also supplied certain Arab states, such as Jordan, with arms. Tension developed when the United States feared Israeli actions might destabilize the balance in the region, as when Kennedy and Ben-Gurion clashed over Israel's nuclear program. Kennedy worried about a broader nuclear arms race. Ben-Gurion viewed the arms race as inevitable, absent U.S.-Soviet détente, and was determined to own the ultimate weapon of deterrence before his neighbors could. Frustrated, Kennedy warned Israel in a bluntly worded letter that U.S. support would be seriously jeopardized, and that Israel risked isolation from the West if it pursued nuclear weapons. The disagreement ultimately played a role in Ben-Gurion's resignation as prime minister. By the time President Lyndon Johnson assumed power, Israel had agreed to allow American inspectors to examine its nuclear capability. As have many other U.S. presidents, Johnson had deep and emotional ties to the Jewish state. He spoke of his admiration for Israel's commitment to democratic values, and of the gallant struggle of modern Jews to be free of persecution. When asked by Soviet Premier Alexei Kosygin why the United States supported Israel, a country of only 3 million people, when there were 80 million Arabs, Johnson replied, "Because it is right." Johnson was the first U.S. president to host an Israeli prime minister at the White House, and the first to directly supply Israel with offensive military weapons. Like his predecessors, Johnson was in part reacting to Soviet moves in the Middle East. He worried that an imbalance in power between the Israelis and the Arabs would invite an Arab attack and instigate a regional war that would threaten U.S.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?